Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Physician's Mind podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Wilkerson. I'm an incoming medical student, and today I was honored to interview Dr. Jackee Clement. Dr. Clement is a graduate of Duke Medical School. She's a current family medicine physician, and she's the CEO and founder of Good Journey, Mental Health and Well-Being. Dr. Clement and I talked about how to optimize yourself for achieving your most ambitious goals. We talked about what defines success and how to best achieve it. We talked about meaningful productivity, sustainable habits for long-term growth. We talked about stress management, combating procrastination, burnout, social media addiction, among many other things. Dr. Clement also shared some of her background and what led up to her doing what she's doing today. This is a very insightful episode, and I learned a lot from Dr. Clement. And if you learned anything, please share with your friends and family on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Now, without further ado, please enjoy this episode, and thank you again so much for tuning in to The Physician's Mind. All right, so Dr. Clement, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. So I always like to start out by asking my guests to share a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What was your family life like? And kind of what led you to a career in medicine?
Gosh, that's a long story. Okay, so I grew up in a divorced household in the inner city of Baltimore. So this is like the 90s. If you know anything about the 90s in Baltimore, it was not a good time. There was like a crack epidemic. It was inglorious. So for whatever reason, I knew in my heart, like so many other doctors, that I wanted to be a healer. I wanted to be a doctor. And that really motivated me to work hard, get straight A's and get out of Baltimore. So I went to the University of Southern California and I actually really relied on my creative side there. I majored in narrative studies. I traveled a bit and then finally went to medical school and I was fortunate enough to go to Duke. And while I was there, I really um, got to know myself a bit more. And I realized I wanted to do things that were a little bit non-traditional and outside of like what you typically would do as a Duke student, internal medicine, surgery. I think that's really when I started to get into coaching. I had my own setbacks in medical school. Imposter syndrome was so rampant for me during medical school. And I sought my own coaches and realized, you know what? I want to help other students and other professionals get well and get rid of their imposter syndrome, avoid burnout. And yeah, that's where it got started for me.
Okay, fantastic. Sounds like a great comeback story, first of all, coming from a family in Baltimore, going to USC, doing some travel, and then ending up at Duke ultimately, where, like most medical students, facing some personal challenges and struggling through the journey of overcoming them, right? And it's awesome how you seem to have turned these situations, like facing imposter syndrome in medical school, into something positive, right? That can help other people out. Now, I want to talk about how you sort of got into the wellness coaching and what kind of led up to that, right? You're a medical student, you have finished your residency in family medicine, and now tell us some more about what led to the creation of this little business.
Okay, so yeah, it really all starts in medical school because prior to getting into medical school, I thought I would be a surgeon and that would just be my career. I think it was when I started having imposter syndrome and really severe anxiety that I started looking for help and I just couldn't find it. I went to the schools, therapists, and I talked to the counselors, and no one could really help me so much. It was mainly just, hey, you have a lot of stress and this is normal. And I guess you just have to deal with it and get through it. And that just wasn't enough for me. And so I slowly started just getting outside of my own perspective and looking at um, thought leaders in like the mindfulness, field. So like spiritual leaders, actually, like Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if you know, do you know him?
The power of now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, oh my gosh, so many thought leaders that really influenced my way of thinking and helped me get out of this like anxiety, depression cycle that I was on. Looking back at it, I think I definitely was burned out. So I went to a conference. It's called the SEEP conference. If any medical students are, thinking about what can they do with their careers. And I met a woman, a family medicine doctor, who would become my coach. And so I think that's really how I started thinking about coaching as a possible career for me. I still wasn't ready to give up medicine because I really do feel like medicine is my calling. I was called to be a doctor, I was called to be a healer, but it expanded my point of view to the point where now I realize you can be a healer in many different ways to people. And so that's why I focused on mental health and wellness.
Very cool. Okay. So you talked about imposter syndrome, right? And I think a lot of what you do in your wellness coaching and your medical career, I think it relates not only to the medical profession, but beyond, right? So can you touch a little bit on what imposter syndrome exactly is? I know it's sort of a feeling like you don't belong or you don't really deserve your position, from what I understand, but could you just maybe provide a more sharp definition for me?
Sure. So, imposter syndrome, and I believe this came out in the 1970s or so, but imposter syndrome is essentially when you have a person, man or woman, who is by all means qualified to be in the position that they're in, but they feel like they're not. They feel like the people around them, their colleagues, their peers, are better than them and will at some point figure out that they don't belong. So then someone who's suffering from imposter syndrome really starts to feel separated from their cohort, and they feel like they don't deserve to be there, and for whatever reason they're not up to par.
Hmm. Okay, so it's somebody who, by all standards of the measure, has the credentials to be in the position they're in, but they feel as if they're not, and they feel as if they're going to be discovered as some sort of fraud, even though that's not going to be the case.
Right. Yes. I think the key feeling there is you just feel afraid all the time. You're
Oh, wow.
always afraid of being discovered as this person who's not so smart or not as competent. And that can be disastrous when you're trying to push yourself and learn academically. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna put a pin in that because I definitely want to discuss some more about that because I know it's common among medical students in hyper competitive professions, and I want to talk about combating that. But another thing I want to talk about now, moving into the more goal setting, sort of optimal behavior frame, right? As a medical student, it's of course a hyper competitive environment where you have to basically be on your A game if you want to succeed. And of course, you have to be resilient, you have to be persistent, right? And part of your work involves optimizing yourself for achievement of difficult goals. So, could you share some principles that you sort of used in your own life and perhaps with some of your clients that helped them optimize themselves for goal setting and goal achievement?
Sure. So, we mentioned medical students. So I think I'll answer this from the perspective of a medical student. This is really when I started to put all of this together anyway. So I created Good Journey Mental Health and Wellness, and I work with professionals, but I love working with medical students. And I created a program, Calm and Productive Med Program. And so there are really five key areas that you have to optimize in order to reach that peak performance. So the first one is time management. The second, stress management. You need to have good self-care. And then for medical students in particular, great study habits and great test taking strategies. So
Mm,
these are the areas where I was struggling as a medical student. And I had to slowly figure that out because, again, no one was there to really help me with that as a medical student and then even as a resident. And as a resident, I kind of got it down and was able to thrive in residency. But the biggest one is time management. I feel like a lot of medical students will come to me and say, I'm not sure if I'm doing this right because it's taking me so long to study for a certain topic, or maybe I'm studying this certain topic too long, and they struggle with balancing their activities, right? And so figuring out how to optimize your time so that you're giving the right amount of time to each task and can still have time to take care of yourself is really challenging. But that's what you have to do in medical school. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. And every student, I mean, they're in different medical schools, so you have to figure that all out along the way. So it's personalized. It honestly is.
Yeah, most definitely. And time management is just so crucial. I hear that so often that it's like you have to give studying the time it deserves, but you also have to find a little bit of time to wind down, rest the brain a little bit, recover for the next fight, if you will, right? I like to compare the medical school to like a training sort of thing, and each test is like a fight or a match or something, and
Yeah.
you got to stay sharp. So very cool though. I like the 5 points, right? To optimize yourself for goal achievement, you have to do the 5 key strategies, which include time management, stress management, self-care, and for medical students, good study strategies and good test taking strategies. Fantastic.
That's right.
So that's awesome. I really like that concept and thank you for sharing that. Another thing I wanted to talk about now on the topic of goal setting and goal achievements, right? Sustainable habits for long-term success. I'm sure you're familiar with James Clear's book Atomic Habits, right? And how it compounds over time and it can be positive
Yeah.
or negative, right? So fostering those successful habits or fostering good habits for long-term success is crucial. But before we talk about the habits that lead to success, I think it's important to define what success is. Of course, there's a common commercial standard of success, right? And that may include financial freedom, a big house, a big car, right? But it's pretty well known that that materialistic view doesn't necessarily lead to the most inner fulfillment. I think it's more important for the context of this discussion to define success from a personal lens, right? Now, what do you think constitutes personal success, right? An inner concept of success.
I'm glad you asked that question. It's really important for everyone to figure out what success means for them. But we can use some of the science that has gone on for well-being to figure out what it will likely mean for everyone and just in general. So for example, you mentioned that, of course, materialism. So like financial success can only get you so far. And everyone knows about the study by now that said like past $75,000 a year, you're not going to be that much happier. So honestly, aim for 75,000 and you're set in terms of like material gain. But there are little things that you can do to make yourself happier and therefore feel successful. One of them would be thinking of others every now and then and volunteering, being of service. And so people who are going into the medical field, that's kind of just tied into your job in many ways, but still you'd be surprised how much taking time away from like the hospital or the clinic and just going to help someone with a book drive could just boost your happiness and help you like feel like you're living a fulfilling life. And I think that's ultimately what you mean by like successful is do you feel fulfilled, right? Do you agree? So
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
something. I think there's this concept of time affluence that people tend to talk about but not really appreciate. So they will say to me all the time, like, oh, I really want to do this project or I really want to write this book, but I just don't have the time. And it's so funny that we have this kind of saying of like time is money when it really isn't. Like you can get money, even if you lose it, you can get it back, but you can't get your time back. So like time affluence is another way to feel successful in life. So you'll see that in businessmen who grind really hard in their 20s and 30s and then they retire early in their 40s and all of a sudden they feel like successful and they feel like they're living a fulfilling life because now they have all this time back. So I think that's a major one too. So we have service, we have time affluence, and gosh, if I were to pinpoint another one for people, I think it would be just knowing who you are, knowing your values. If you don't know what's the most important to you, there's no way you're going to feel like you're successful in life. It's just impossible because your actions won't line up with what you truly care about. And you'd be surprised how many people say they value one thing, but their actions are in a completely different field. So yeah, I think that's the most important thing to leading a fulfilling, successful life.
Those are three great points, and I agree. And in fact, I think on the last topic, it's true that a lot of people will claim a certain set of values, but the behavior is completely opposite, right? And that leads
Yeah.
into a sort of nuanced discussion of like, does your behavior indicate more of what you value and all that sort of stuff? But that's awesome. So selflessness and sort of being of service to others is awesome because I've actually, right, like there's a degree of rational selfishness, right? Like, of course, if you're going to be a hyper ambitious person, like you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of others. Similar to like on the airplane, right? They tell you secure your own mask before you help out anybody else because if you're not
Exactly.
breathing, you can't help somebody else. So, and that's obvious, right? So get your stuff squared away, right? Find what you value, do some of that inner searching and then make an effort to be of service to other people. And then time affluence is so awesome as well. And I think that also leads to a little more nuanced financial discussion, right? Because if you can find a way to stop exchanging time for money, you can make your money work for you. It gives you some more time. And then with that time, you can do things like help other people out or spend time vacationing or whatever it may be that brings you happiness. So, and then of course, finally, like we talked about, finding your values. So, great 3 points to define that inner success, which I think is more important than commercial success from an outsider standpoint, right? It's more important to define it within yourself than to seek the fulfillment from people around you. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that insight with me. Now, let's talk a little bit about habits. Med school is a pretty well defined path for most people, right? You have to get good grades, you have to get some research, you have to perhaps volunteer, you have to be involved in a few programs to show that you're interested in it, and you have to score well on your step exams and interview well, and so on and so forth. But to take it a little step back, what are some of the most efficient habits that you see among successful medical students?
Yeah, so like you said, like once you're accepted into medical school, you're on the path, and as long as you follow the path, you're going to come out the other side as a doctor. But you see these students who have varying degrees of success in medical school, and I really do think it does boil down to habits. So successful students, they are the ones who know to reach out for help sooner rather than later. That's something that I really struggled with. It was just ingrained in me to just solve all my own problems. And that independence was what took me so long to reach out for help. So they number one know how to reach out for help. They know how to ask questions, right? That's another part of reaching out for help, but I'll clump them together. They also prioritize themselves. Like you said, they put themselves first. And it's easier said than done. I still am in awe of the medical students who are able to run a marathon, write a book, like do all of this profound research, and they're in medical school. I'm in awe of them because I wasn't that student, but they put themselves first, right? So my like top students in my class, they were always running when they weren't in class. They would always prioritize their physical health, their emotional health, and then they would start, studying, for the remaining hours in the evening or something like that. Whereas I got very stressed and thought, oh God, I think I just need to study more because I felt like maybe I just wasn't smart enough or I wasn't getting the material, right? So I think that's really important too, putting yourself first. The other thing is they had a game plan. Like probably even before they came into medical school, they had a game plan. And I just wasn't aware of that. Being a first generation student, I thought you come to school, they'll tell you what to do and you'll be fine. And yes, to a degree that works, but the top students knew exactly what to do before they even got there. Honestly, they were like studying for step one, like before they went to med school, like that kind of student. And I mean, it works, it works. You have to know what you want. And they wanted to be the top student in medical school. I just wanted to be a doctor, so that wasn't a part of my game plan. But yeah, that's what I see.
That's awesome. Yeah. Game plan, so important because if you don't have a specific goal, right, you're going to be either moving without aim or you're going that like the two worst things you can do is move without aim, right? Like because you're gonna have to go forward in some sense, regardless of whether or not you have a goal. So you can go forward without a goal, or you can have a goal and not move at all, right? It's like so it starts with having a specific game plan, like you said, right? Whatever that may
Yeah.
be for the individual, because then you have something to work towards. You have something that justifies the work you're doing. And then on the flip side, it sort of gives you something to run away from, right? Because you can think about, well, what would I be if I didn't achieve this goal? What would I be if I was the opposite of somebody who, right? Like, for example, if you have the goal of getting an A on the next exam, like what would I be if I was a person that didn't want the A in the exam? Well, I would fail the exam. So that's something that I don't want to become. So let's run away from that towards the next goal of getting an A. So stressing the importance of having a specific plan is crucial. And thank you for sharing that. And asking questions,
You're
not being
welcome.
afraid to find help. I think that's another very important topic, right? Because it requires some humility. It requires accepting that, okay, I don't know everything. And it's okay because nobody really knows everything, right? And the more you ask questions, the
Yeah.
more you will learn. So, fantastic points. Now,
Yeah, and I'm just gonna add in, like, that's the reason why we really have to be more sensitive to first year medical students, and especially, I mean, pretty much everyone at some point suffers from imposter syndrome in medical school because you were a, top student in your school, and then you come together, and it's just all brilliant minds. But the people who recover from it quickly are then able to ask the right questions and get the help because they're not ashamed anymore. They're not carrying around that fear. So that's why it's really important. This is like really important to teach to medical students early on because it makes a difference. Like to this day, I don't know whether I would have become a surgeon or not, if I had tackled some of the emotional issues that I was having being in such a different and like competitive space like medical school. So yeah, I think that's really important. I just wanted to reiterate that.
yeah, absolutely, right. And that's another thing because you'll oftentimes feel as though you're the only one dealing with a particular issue. More often than not, it's a lot more people than you think, right? And another thing on that topic, I had a discussion with a medical student a few weeks ago, and she said along a similar line with the imposter syndrome and whatnot, and she kind of came to terms with it by understanding it's like, look, you are here. They accepted your application among thousands of other ones. You have what it takes to be here. You deserve to be here. You put in the work to be here. Understanding that and overcoming that hurdle will enable you to perform to your maximal potential. So it's very important for first year medical students to sort of think of that and understand that they're not alone. So, yeah, another great point there. Now, stress management, medical school, and other fast paced professions are obviously very stressful. They take a toll on you, right? But that's part of the deal. That's part of what you know you were getting into. And it requires resilience. It requires good stress management strategies, and it requires that understanding. Now, that being said, it's still not easy. So, what do you recommend for the student who feels overwhelmed, who feels stressed out, and might need some advice?
Yeah, so number one, if you're a medical student and you feel overwhelmed and you're stressed, take a break. Take a break. Honestly, that is the number one thing you should do. You're not going to think clearly if you aren't sleeping well, you're not eating properly. It's just not going to happen for you. So, however you can, take an extra 15, 30 minutes in the day just to do nothing. Give yourself the permission to put yourself first. That's like number one. But stress management is a really tricky thing because you think all it has to do, like, you think the only thing you have to do is relax. Like, oh, just stop being stressed. But it's quite difficult actually. There's the actual work burden that you face as a medical student. And then there's the mental toll that has on you, and that produces the emotions that you feel. And so when I work with clients, yes, we try to tackle the workload, but there are things we can control and things we can't control. So sometimes the workload is the workload. The the best thing, the thing that's going to give you the most bang for your buck, is figuring out how to change the way you think and therefore change the way you feel about the scenario. And that actually really reduces stress for many people.
Yeah, I like that because I agree with the fact that you can sort of change the way you look at a situation and alter the way you feel about it. It's like the Shakespeare quote, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right? So the way you approach
Exactly.
things,
Yeah.
it's like it's all in your perception. So
Mhm.
very good points there, right? And it's not all about just sitting down doing nothing, but kind of understanding the workload, finding the strategies to approach it, and having that intentional wind down period. And I know something
Yeah.
that
I
probably
mean, we all know the things they tell you to do for stress management. So I figured I should talk about the crux of the matter, and it's the thinking. Because yes, I can tell you to go exercise, make sure you get your sleep in, and like eat well, but it's a medical school.
right.
So
It's not that simple. It's just not.
yeah.
All right. Well, I know one thing for sure that won't help combat stress management or procrastination is social media use, compulsive social media use, that is, right? And I saw, I believe it was a blog post on your site that's like, what do you do when you know you have an exam to study for, but instead you find yourself on the couch scrolling social media, still with the idea that you know you have work to do, but for some reason, right, you aren't doing it, right? And that's just a classic challenge for humanity since we've kind of existed, right? Like I know what I need to do, but I don't do it. So I think a lot of that is kind of personal willpower and having that understanding, but I think still there's a little bit of there's probably some methods beyond just personal will and discipline, right? And maybe you could share some strategies to combat that procrastination and compulsive social media use.
Yes, absolutely. So procrastination, I love the topic of procrastination. I actually am going to launch a Facebook group called Common Productive, the Common Productive Community, so that we can do a challenge together that really works on just breaking down procrastination. And so that's going to launch October 28th. So procrastination for me, it's really just about overwhelm. It's about trying to be perfect, being afraid of making decisions. You know, there are all these factors that go into it. And so, as a medical student, when you're sitting on the couch binge watching Netflix, I'm sorry, I know this is not every medical student, but just for example, and you know that you have to be studying for an exam, you really have to ask yourself, like, why am I doing that? And so I love working with people and just figuring out some of the deeper reasons. Because sure, we can all say, oh, I'm doing this because I'm tired, or I'm doing this because I feel overwhelmed, but we just need to go deeper. And then once you figure out what's going on, then obviously you address it, you find a new way to think about it, you find new strategies to keep yourself from getting to that point so that you can get productive and stay productive and not fall into this procrastination anxiety cycle, as I call it. Because at the end of the day, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing and you're sitting on the couch watching TV, you're not actually relaxing. You're just like avoiding the anxiety for as long as you can, but it's there and it's building, and eventually it's going to rear its ugly head. So that's why I love procrastination, because it's like something that is so within our ability to address. So
Yeah, yeah, and sort of exploring the deeper meaning behind what you're doing, right? Because I like how you said you're not really relaxing because it's still kind of there. And the best strategy is probably just to turn around and face it and not run away from the problem. You just have to kind of confront the issue at hand. That's probably one of the best strategies and find out what's the real reason here. Am I just kind of afraid to tackle this issue? What's going on? So it's often not as superficial as we may think. So great point there. Now, it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. So as we wrap up this conversation here, I want to ask you a couple more questions, right? The first one is just generally combating burnout in fast-paced professions, particularly in medicine. And then just I wanted to ask you to share any last-minute advice before we part ways.
okay, so first tackling burnout, right? Okay. So usually I recommend just figuring out if what you're experiencing is burnout or something else, because yes, burnout is its own mental health condition, but you can have other things going on. It could be anxiety, it could be depression. So just figuring that out is really important. And I actually have an assessment on my website, goodjourneywellness.com, where you can click on the link and then do your burnout assessment and see what areas may be lacking for you. For medical students, for residents, physicians, burnout is so prevalent. I think it increased dramatically within the COVID years and it's on the decline. ways to prevent that is just taking a break, like I said. Like, I'm sorry, I know it sounds very simple. It's one of those easier said than done things, but you need to figure out where you are and where you want to go in order to get there. Because if you are experiencing burnout right now, you're not going to get there from here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And stop me if I'm like not answering your question because I love these topics and I'll just go. But yeah, that's my recommendation is you need to take a pause. You need to think about where you are, where you're trying to go, and then not be afraid to ask for help. Like don't wait until it gets worse to ask for help.
Agreed. Right. Yeah. Take a pause because you're not going to be able to solve the problem when you're in the chaos, right? Take a pause, breathe,
Exactly.
game plan once again, right? Once you're kind of relaxed, once you have a sort of a separation from the chaos, think, right? Because like you said, you're not going to get there from point of high stress or what have you. So, yeah, awesome. Now, we have a lot of medical students that listen to this show. We have a lot of potentially other individuals that are interested in just optimizing their lifestyle. So, in that regard, do you have any last minute tips or advice that you would want to share to someone interested in optimizing their lifestyle for human efficiency?
Sure, yes. If you want to optimize your lifestyle for just efficiency, I think really going back to the values, going back to your why is going to get you where you want to go. So thinking about why you want to be a doctor, like why are you going to medical school? Because there are different ways of being a healer. That's a big one. And once you figure that out for yourself, then you weigh the pros and cons. You figure out like what you're willing to live with and what you're willing to live without. And it's not pretty, honestly. Life is just sometimes just matter of fact. But yeah, I think it's a lot of introspection. And once you have that motivation based off of your why, then you're unstoppable.
Awesome. Yeah, you have to find that why because it's like that's what's going to sustain you through the difficult times, the challenges of life, right? Not a superficial goal or what have you. It's going to be that deep personal motivation that's going to carry you through the tough times. So, Dr. Clement, we've had a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing some of your tips on productivity, successful habits, goal setting, stress management, procrastination. It's been a great conversation. This is what the physician's mind is all about, talking to professionals who have been through it and who have the advice that we need. So, thank you so much for joining me today and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course.